in development. Thank you. Everything from a small housing development to a kind of a neighbourhood-wide development. And if in my view, if developers know that their proposals will be judged by how well they promote walking and active travel, then I think we should see dramatically different proposals and outcomes. And this isn't a theoretical question in Greater Manchester. 9 out of the 10 boroughs are currently drawing up an overarching development plan, places for everyone, and that will feed through to the individual plans of each of Bolton, Bury, Manchester, Oldham, Rochdale, Salford and Tameside and Wigan. And the 10th authority, Stockport, is developing its own local plan. These questions are on the agendas of all the local authorities in Greater Manchester at the moment, and we do have the possibility of getting involved. This morning we've got 2 presentations. Nick Evans from Sport England will say a little about where we are up to in terms of the local plan process. We'll focus on what evidence we should be collating and promoting to make the case to include walking in local plans, and what are some of the barriers that stop walking from influencing the development. Tim Emery from the Town and Country Planning Association will look at a little bit more detail of the local planning process and offer some illustrations of plans and design guidance and talk about the opportunity for community engagement. There'll be time for questions and discussion at the end, at the conclusion of the second half of the session. And please use the chat facility for any comments, thoughts, ideas you have during the course of the conversation. And we want to encourage colleagues to exchange contact details in the chat so that we can continue the conversation and collaboration after the event. That's all from me by way of introduction. So can I ask Nick Evans, who's the head of planning at Sport England and currently leads on a lot of their work of looking at active environments and how the physical environment can provide the conditions for people to be more active, to give us our first presentation. Nick, over to you.
Great. Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks for that, Alan. So Tim and I are going to do a kind of a very quick whistle-stop tour of kind of the local plan process. And I'm going to concentrate on the front end and talk more about the evidence base and how Walkington can integrate more into that. And then Tim is going to talk about the next bit. So Louise, can I have the next slide, please? Great, thanks for that. So I suppose the bit that you're probably aware of is the planning system is about to go through another change, probably the most radical change that's been happened for probably well over 30 years. So this is the proposed local plan process. What you'll see, the most important changes to make is going to be more on I think the length or the timing to do this. And it will probably take a good 2 years fruition to go through the kind of process through the parliamentary bill, and all subsequent secondary legislation will kind of follow it. 2 important points here to highlight are those in green. These are the 2 areas of where there is more of that public consultation and more for third parties to get involved. That is stage 1, call for areas, and then the submission to the Secretary of Publication when you publish it for comment. The draft plan is published for comment. So the starting point, I think, with all these things is the bits around. Well, that's kind of interesting. Not quite sure what's happened here. The bits around the corporate plan and vision, because that is really the first point where you can actually get into the local plan, because these are the bits where you can have a lot of hooks where a local authority will start to think about what is it going to deliver for citizens over its period, what is it actually going to do, and you will find those hooks in there, particularly now around climate change and around and health and well-being. So that is the kind of first bit around those hooks. And the next bit is this stuff around the evidence base. And what I would say at the moment is probably because we're going to go through this period of change, a lot of local authorities who will start to put off reviewing their local plans because there's something will come forward. So what will probably happen is they will start to actually thinking about those call for areas in advance, but they also start to think about how we got our evidence base up to date. So it's an opportune moment to engage in that, because that's probably what's going to happen over the next certainly next 18 months around that. Local authorities will start to do that. But there's another opportunity here, because as we're building back for COVID, what you'll be finding within local authorities and other partners is everyone's started to think about, how do I change my service delivery building back from COVID? So what are the different approaches that are going to happen? There'll be more probably emphasis on how do you build on the community resilience and other things that come out of COVID, and how that can be drawn into that process as well, and that review period. So it is probably an opportune time now, as things start to happen. It'll be interesting to see what happens with some of those local authorities follow that within Manchester. So next slide, please. Okay, so what I put here is just, this is not supposed to be an exhaustive list of the types of other evidence base that are kind of relevant to walking within a local plan process. And it's important to note, as I put on the bottom, they're not necessarily all triggered by a local plan review. You know, some of these could be happening at any time and linked to kind of service delivery within that local authority. What I'm not going to dwell on here is not going to dwell on the kind of local plan or elsewhere, because you'll be well aware of those kind of bits, but start to think about all the other elements that are probably being prepared that are also relevant for walking. We're putting walking at the heart of them. So if I take quickly for an example, you've got the local sport and recreation strategy. So, you know, for example, we know at the moment, you know, we're getting heavily involved with local authorities really thinking about post-COVID review of their facility stock. But thinking much more about, well, how do I actually deliver the strategic outcomes for my citizens in my area? So is that doing things differently? And we have a document called the Strategic Outcomes Planning Guidance, which helps guide local authorities through that process. But it very much starts with the individual. So you may end up with a nice shiny sports centre or things at the far end of it. But I think what that process is now thinking about is much more about how you deliver physical activity and sport in that area, which does include things like walking policies and those elements around cycling as well. So that's one area that you can see is kind of important. Another classic one, I would say, that you probably have already or might be engaging in, is things like the green infrastructure parks and open space strategies. Again, through the pandemic, you know, we've seen the very much important of those green infrastructure parks. And often, you know, we talk about the quality of parks and the great things that parks provide themselves, but people often forget about some of the biggest barriers that are all around the entrances and safe routes to those parks, and particularly in some areas which, you know, might have a park on their doorstep but don't find that park that accessible. So again, that's all linked through the importance of walking being linked back into that. Climate change is quite an obvious one, and the other big one that is that we all know at the moment, and we've seen through is the kind of retail and leisure studies that will be going on. You know, you've had considerable government funding going into through the Towns Fund and the Healthy High Streets Fund, and some of that will have gone into some of those Manchester authorities. But really thinking about the role that walking plays in there. And there was a very good study that was done by London TfL, sorry, in 2017 called Street Appeal, which compared 5 places that had sustained investment in the public realm against 5 places that didn't have any sustained investment in the public realm, but really show things like, you know, a larger uplift in retail values going up by 7.5% per annum, a large boost in static walking, static activities that took place, a 93% boost in walking in those areas where you've had that sustained investment in public realm. So walking, again, we know goes hand in hand with successful leisure retail places as well. I mean, the leisure, when we think about how town centres is going to build back, offer things differently, the importance of leisure-based activities, you know, there was that study shows almost a 260% hike in those kind of leisure-based activities that happened within those areas. So again, walking very important in supporting that. So if we go on to the next slide. And Tim will probably come back on this, talking about the 20-minute neighbourhood and things like that. And I suppose the other way is to flip this around and thinking about, you know, how, again, accessibility in terms to services through walking. So on the left hand, this is just some of the tools that could help you in some of your kind of discussions with local authorities, looking at a different service sort of provider. So on the left hand side is a kind of extract from our Active Places Power website. This is our access analysis tool. So this is Salford, and this is purely looking at, you know, how much of the local population is within 10 minutes walk of a health and fitness facility. So those areas, those red dots there, are in fact OS output areas where there's no access. The kind of yellow dots in there are the health and fitness facilities, and the green ones representing the ones that actually have access. So you can start to help, use these type of tools to start to help those other services think about accessibility around those things. And typically you get people talk about access standards. So often the classic one, everyone should be within 100 meters of a green space, which is fine. The problem with standards sometimes is developers will take those as see those as maximum standards rather than minimum standards. So they're put forward as minimum standards of plan. So as kind of walking partners, you need to think about, well, actually, also for the impact of the customer or the consumer on the other stand, it's not just about the accessibility, because you can have you could be access to 100 meters of green space, but is it usable? What is the quality like? Is that a welcoming environment? So often these are management issues as well you need to be aware of when you're thinking about those standards. And on the right hand side is another tool. This is space syntaxes, open mapping tool. So this is where they've developed the whole country. It's released an open data set, and it talks about accessibility of streets, and those with the red in there, that's Manchester, are streets with highly accessible. So they can highly go from those streets and access a lot more areas much more quickly because the right network is there in terms of walking. And what they've done through that, they've also effectively built up a walkability and mixed use analysis tool around that. So starting again, when you think about the 20-minute neighbour, thinking about areas and how accessible they are to walking, and they produced a kind of walk about the importance of mixed use, again as part of that evidence base and that argument you're putting back to local authorities, the importance of walking. That was done with the Prince's Foundation. So lastly, before I hand over to Tim, next slide, just going to pose a few questions for later. We can get into discussion, which areas of the evidence base are likely to have the biggest benefit for walking when you think about those strategies. Is walking missing any key evidence to help it influence those areas? And are there any other barriers that are stopping walking from influencing the development of local plan policy? So that was my bit, and over to Tim.
Right, thanks, Nick. And yeah, that was great. So moving on from that idea of building evidence base and that vision set in which Nick's has talked about, I'm going to talk a bit more about local plan policy and also public participation and consultation. So when we think about local plans and policies, including policies on active travel is a really powerful tool to influence planning outcomes. So policies related to walking specifically that are included in local plans can set out sort of clear expectations of what is required and can help to ensure that local priorities are considered by decision makers. So having those hooks in plans will really help strengthen the ability of local plan authorities and officers to actually deliver things on the ground, the things that we want. And planning policies and the design of sort of new developments themselves should really put people rather than vehicles at their heart. I think that's one of the key message from this big active conversation today. And our policies and new developments, they should facilitate easy access to sort of the day-to-day services that people need and be designed to prioritize walking, cycling and public transport. So people there's a lot of choice for people, so they can make real choices about how they travel. And Nick's mentioned about the 20-minute neighbourhood, and that is a key factor. So thinking about those principles behind the 20-minute neighbourhood, what do people have access to, what do they don't? So that evidence base should really identify those major gaps in connectivity for active travel. And in that evidence base, you can see the pyramid that should relate to those planning policies. And policies should relate to the wider local plan objectives for promoting sustainable transport, and having that strong vision at the top of creating healthier places and communities in the first place is also really powerful. We sometimes talk about sustainable development being a theme, sort of a golden thread running throughout the national planning policy framework, and local plans can do the same thing with their own priorities. So if that is sustainable transport and walking, which it should be, that golden thread can run throughout the plan as well. So next slide, please, Louise. So I'm here really just to signpost you to some good examples as well. So here we have the new London plan, which was adopted in March this year, and that has really strong policies for active travel. And I'm using the example of London here as comparisons can be made to Manchester, both very, very large urban cities with large and growing populations. And we can think about a similar policy context as well in a minute. So the London plan has adopted a target of making 80% of all trips in London to be made by foot. cycle or public transport by 2041. This is a massive ambition, and it also aligns with the Mayor's transport strategy. And the London Plan has also adopted the Healthy Street Indicators, which some of you might be familiar with. So all new developments have to show how they will deliver improvements based on these 10 principles. And they cover things like noise, safety, air quality, and then places to rest. And the London Plan is also aligned with guidance produced by Transport for London, and developments, again, are required to conform with this guidance. So next slide, please, Louise. Oh, thanks. So here we have a clear policy framework from Transport for London, which is a really good example. So that we have their overarching strategy, which includes the vision and objectives for creating better streets, followed by their action plan, setting out specific sort of initiatives to support the strategy. And then we have a really detailed design guidance. So this planning for walking toolkit and streetscape guidance is particularly helpful. And the toolkit itself is really it's kind of a handbook for planners, transport planners and developers to embed those walking design principles. So I guess one of the questions we can think about today is would the similar sort of policy structure work for Greater Manchester? Next slide, please, Louise. And thinking about sort of design still, I thought it was worth highlighting the National Design Guide and the recently published draft model design code. So there are lots of sections in here dedicated to active travel and how local authorities should be planning for this. And the government is urging local authorities now to develop their own design codes at various scales. So whether that is whole authority areas down to specific development sites and plots. So there's a real opportunity here through these design frameworks to really strengthen the active travel network. So next slide, please. So we've taken a quick look at London, but is there something similar? Is there scope for something similar in Manchester? So especially thinking about the Greater Manchester Spatial Framework or a plan of 9 places for everyone, which, so that equivalent plan would be equivalent to the London plan. So that's why I've sort of made those comparisons. So you'll all be more familiar with the projects that are happening in Manchester right now, but you also have things like the interim active travel design guidance, the made to move strategy, and the streets for all approach as well. So it's kind of thinking how all these different strategies fit in together, and are there any gaps that would help strengthen the approach to achieve better outcomes on the ground? So that's really one of the key sort of messages from today I will try and get across. So next slide, please. And it's also really important to talk about public engagement. So the people who live and work in a place and neighborhood, they're the people that are best placed to know what is good and what is not good about it. So what's working and what's not, particularly thinking about active travel, people that are using these streets daily. So Nick mentioned about public participation sort of schedule in terms of local plan stages. This is another example diagram here. So engaging with residents and businesses as early as possible in order to understand their needs and involve the community will really help shape proposals for the better and on the ground. And yeah, in terms of the local plan process, there are those formal stages of public consultation, but this needs to be more than just an online survey, and it needs to be inclusive to everyone. And communities often feel excluded from the decisions that affect them the most, so they do really need to be consulted and engaged. So next slide, please. And there are lots of good examples of community engagement practices out there. We've mentioned some this morning with listening, and we also have the NHS Healthy Newtown series. So this is a picture from Whitehill and Borden down in Hampshire, where they carried out walkabout surveys and wayfinding surveys. And we can think about things like structured workshops and events like the one we're doing now. So there's also a really great tool to get people engaged. And there are also lots of examples of local authorities getting creative, using digital apps, digital engagement, things like that. And then thinking again about the National Model Design Code, there is a whole section in guidance notes on community engagement. So this is something that we really need to push and get better at doing, really. And that's me, Louise. So yeah, happy to pick up questions and discussions in a bit.
Very much, Tim. We put up on the screen some of the questions that particularly arise from the presentations. But just before we go into that, I just picked up a couple of points from Graham in the chat. A question to Nick in terms of the space syntax material. Graham was asking, is that free? And the second point, perhaps more to Tim, you mentioned the interim design guide, the Greater Manchester Interim Design Guide. But those colleagues have looked at that, but the walking element of that very much is a click here and you get through to the TfL resources, which is fine insofar as it is. But I think Graham's point, and I would agree with him, is that we really need to do some more work to provide a much more Greater Manchester context to some of that. I don't know whether Tim wants to say a bit more about that first. But Nick, is space syntax free?
The open mapping is free, but no, the other bits that sit around it would not be free. I mean, you'd have to go to Space Syntax and have that conversation with them. So they release all the accessibility data. So if you had a GIS with a local authority, you could import all that data in, but then you'd have to work out the kind of, you could probably design a very similar thing around accessibility, but you need all the other stuff around, you know, postcodes or locations of other services. I mean, there are other data sets out there, but they're usually chargeable, such as Point X, which is a kind of list of all locations of all different types of services, from, you know, locations of parks and you know, banks, all those kind of stuff that you might think about when you're developing that 20-minute neighborhood and that accessibility stuff. But again, you have to pay for that. So
I mean, some of that data will have been worked on with in the LCWIP process, looking at, you know, local neighbourhoods, but that's something we can pick up directly with TFGM colleagues. Tim, in terms of the interim design guide, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's any opportunity for that to be improved upon, but the fact that you've got that in place already is a great start. Some places don't have interim design guidance, so it's fantastic that it's there. I know you said that although it signposts to TfL guidance, which, yeah, it doesn't provide that local context, which, yeah, that is really important. Is that local context that's key really to knowing what weaknesses, those gaps are there, thinking about building evidence base again. So yeah, I guess if there's any sort of opportunity to sort of advocate for improving what is already there, or I know we don't want to pile more wood on the fire kind of thing, but don't want to necessarily create more guidance, because too much guidance can get confusing. So that's why I use the TfL, that structure. It's quite easy to follow. It's easy for officers to pick up and developers to see. It's very clear what's expected. So yeah, if any sort of opportunity to either improve that design guidance, I think that would be that would be the first sort of point of call, really.
Thank you. Graham, you put another question in the chat. You want to just join us and ask the question directly?
I was just going to say, like, how crucial, like, the site selection methodology for sites is. I think even at the early point, you know, you should be looking at what sites you're actually proposing to take forward, and, you know, there should be within 400 meters of a bus route, for instance, but where, like, it might be 400 meters only, you know, halfway through the site. You then maybe we'll take that site forward, but as part of a site-specific policy for it, you would say, you know, on the periphery of a bus route, you need to improve the walking and cycling routes to make them direct to the bus stop. I think that's one thing that people miss more than anything. It's like, you can have the policy written down and say, you shall do this, you shall do that, but if you're not taking the sites forward that are within the reach of these routes, then you're always sort of like, you're just going to be ingraining the fact that, well, I need me 2 cars and I need them on the driveway, etc. And you're perpetuating the low density sprawl that we get basically in Greater Manchester.
Yeah, Timon, do you want to come back on that?
Nick, do you want to? I don't mind. I can come in on that one.
Want to come in on that one?
Yeah, definitely great. And that site selection is really important. And local authority, I guess, we're kind of at the mercy of landowners, and it's those sites that come up that are available to then develop on that is really crucial. So locate the location of new developments and where we build new communities is really important, and making sure that they have that accessibility there. But it is a real challenge. It is really difficult, that land supply. Local authorities might not have their own access, their own sites to develop on, but they should do. But then it also, the flip side, so developers, it's getting them on board as well, promoting this agenda of active travel, getting them on board, educating them, and working sort of together on sites is really important. Thinking back to those design frameworks and making sure active travel is really, really pushed, and then also thinking about that policy, having that policy in place so it all trickles down is really important. But no, it's where we decide to build on those sites that are available, it is a real challenge. I don't know, Nick, if you have anything else.
No, I mean, also you get the sites that are connected. You know, you've had legacy of, you know, low density around areas, and then you've got the dreaded cul-de-sacs of the future. Of, you know, those developments are never. When you start to plonk another development next to it, then you can't get through the site. There's no permeability of the site, so it increases the walking distance of it. I mean, the other important thing is really then, you know, in this debate is public transport, because that is really crucial of linking some of these sites together, and how you engage with the kind of wider discussions that you'd hope the transport planners are having around some of these sites in the future. And evidently the move towards the design codes will be better in this, because they will be, you know, there's lots of things that they're going to put in that the developer will need to do to actually get that planning permission. So it is slightly brighter, it's a certain sense of what's happened before, but we'll wait and see. And again, the big problem with all these things is, you know, your speculative developer, it just wants to, you know, build on the site and move on. You know, again, it's this problem about, you know, your best developers are the master developers who will stay there, who are there for the longer term, and therefore have a much more interest in the quality of the environment that they're providing on site and those connections for that community they're actually creating.
Sean's put a question in the chat about alignment with existing highways and footpaths. Sean, do you want to answer that question?
Cheers. Thank you, Alan. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, it's just that I saw a presentation by Warrington Council a couple of weeks back where they had actually, I think, rediscovered about 100 kilometres or 50 kilometres of footpaths from basically, you know, going out there and carrying out maintenance on these footpaths that have been neglected for quite a few years. And he said it was quite amazing because these were existing assets that they had that, you know, just had been left to sort of been overgrown, and they sort of really sort of, you know, increase the width of the footpaths and the accessibility of footpaths. And I'm wondering, is there something that could be maybe tied into the policy or to the guidance that says, you know, actually, we've got these assets. Don't be thinking about maybe creating new assets to maintain before you actually start looking at what actually you've got on your doorstep in the first place.
Thank you very much for that, John. That's obviously something that's very close to the Ramblers' hearts in terms of recognising the value of the network, the existing network we've got, building on that rather than. Anyway, Tim or Nick, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say, yeah, I mean, the biggest challenge is often is around the existing infrastructure and making better use of the existing infrastructure. And, you know, we're all pedestrians and we all look at the quality of those streets, and it's how do you link, I think, again, much more important to how the transport plan aspirations are much more better aligned sometimes with a local plan than they often are in part. And there's some other interesting initiatives, you said that around that. I know there's remapping of lost sort of footpaths going on at the moment, but there's also Dan Raven Ellison's got doing a project. He was the one who set up the National Park in London. He's doing a slowways project at the moment, which is quite interesting, which is where, you know, people are mapping you know, routes between places, and often it is those things. You know, seen quite a lot within the, you know, through the pandemic of rediscovering these places that we've forgotten routes, and it's something that can be linked more to that kind of crowdsourcing bit with local groups pushing these kind of routes. And I suppose again, it's how do you articulate that into the local plan, the needs of those local residents in those areas to get those places upgraded that they feel are really beneficial to them in terms of increasing their physical activity and health.
Mike put a point in the chat. Do you want to you want to just chip in at this point, Mike?
No, it's just my experience on a planning committee for the last couple of years. I'd say about 90% of the time we spent in discussing planning applications was basically on the rights of cars. We have quite a progressive local plan and it's getting more progressive, but actually I predict that in 5 years' time, planning committee will still be spending 95% of its time on space for cars. And I think it's, although it's sad, I think one of the things I would say is that if we treat it as an either or, that we are green campaigners and we don't want to discuss cars, we're missing out and we're becoming ignored. We've got to think about this because I don't own a car, but I recognise that so many people, it is the most important thing. I'd say children's play counted for less than 1% of our time and cars about 97. And it's such a shame, but it's true.
Louise, you want to come in at that point?
Well, I think that point there you made, Mike, about the broader holistic thing links to my point in the chat as well, which is, you know, how do we broaden the conversation away from just standards? This was Nick saying, you know, he's got his 100-metre standard for green space. Planners taking it as, your maximums rather than minimums. And how do we broaden the discussion away from just metrics, right, this is 100, to the quality of life in concept for these things? So Mike, your point about the cars, you've said 1% on children's play, hardly anything on air quality, but actually what can we put something in our GM frameworks and policies that drives a different conversation to support planners and planning committees to have that conversation? There's not just 100 metres, but it is the accessibility, it is the fact that this is space for communities. So what are the mechanisms? It goes back to the conversation. What do we need to do differently around that drives that conversation to be more holistic and bring in the needs of people? And I don't know that.
I think Louise, I was going to come back on that. I mean, I think some of this bit, you know, is the car, the domination of the car. I mean, I look at the low traffic neighbourhoods, and you know, as soon as you mention you've already started off in a negative. So the whole thing will start off negative. You haven't. If you're going to reduce car usage or do things like that, you need to create the vision around it, and that is the systems change. So it's a lot of the wider work that GM Moving and doing, or putting into that. But if you're going to, you know, radically change neighbourhoods, you have to create that vision and bring that communities with you about how you want to see the things improve. And it has to go across. It's not just walking; it's around all the other bits of the services that sit around that. And that is a challenge about how the local plan process pulls those policies together to actually do that, and doesn't sit every policy in silos. Now that is a challenge, and often that is that place making. So how do you develop that stuff in those neighbourhoods to make those kind of communities really engage with that process when they come out for the local plan process? Think about, you know, the journeys they make locally, and the role of walking within that. I think is a kind of it will see what happens with the new system, with the design code supporting it. But yeah, so that was kind of my kind of take on it. Part of that bit, not just rely on the standards. See that vision bit.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, like, you know, that he's right in what he says about like showing people the vision and say, like, you know, well, this site, you know, we could develop it so that it's got walking inside and it's heart. You know, wouldn't that, you know, don't you want to live in that sort of environment, etc. So you do take people on that journey, but then also, for instance, you know, when we're looking at allocations and stuff, like, you would maybe argue that the sites that are within 800 meters of a Metrolink stop, for instance, when the metros are running every 10 minutes, you should be saying, right, well, we actually want to do something higher density, and we want to reduce the amount of car parking that's provided on site, and or have no car parking if it's located within a town centre, for instance. It's those sort of measures, I think, that, you know, that there's a bit of sort of like, you know, carrot and stick approach as well that you can take.
Yeah. Tim, did you want to come back on any of that?
Yeah, I guess it is a challenge. I mean, people get scared. It's like, we're not going to take cars away completely. It's just changing. It's making people are aware that we just need to change our relationship with using cars. We need to stop making that the default. We're not taking them away, we're just kind of reducing our need to use them. But I would emphasize that point that Nick making is getting everyone behind the same vision, getting everyone on board. That communication is really important, and that's something that came out of the 20-minute neighborhood work that we've done, is getting everyone on that shared vision really helps moving forward, because everyone knows what the outcome will be. It's not a surprise. But also, we haven't talked about monitoring. Monitoring is also something really important. So showing people what works in more walkable places, it actually helps businesses. It helps people improve their physical activity. Like, it actually works. So that is also a really important aspect. But yeah, it's not.
It's funny actually, because one of the crucial aspects for me is density. Without the increased density, you're not going to create those environments that encourage, I think, walking. But on the flip side of that, I think, I've seen on Twitter, for instance, stuff, you get people from Barrett's and stuff saying, oh, well, people want a garden, and that means we have to build our sprawl everywhere. And it's like, well, we don't. And it's that sort of, it's all those competing agendas, private housing, land supply, people want a garden, etc. Well, people might not want a garden if they've got high quality open space, for instance, within a 5-minute walk of their house. But we don't, we don't think that. We're just thinking purely about numbers, I think, at the moment, or at least central government now, with a fig leaf about design quality.
How do we build the case for some of these changes? I mean, Nick was talking about what are the sorts of things we need to focus on in terms of the evidence bit. Mike was talking about the kind of the current predominance of provision for cars. How do we? What are the sorts of things we need to do to shift the focus from the sorts of pressures that have just been described to a starting point that says how do we design something that from the outset is about promoting activity and active lives and so, I mean, I know this is work that both Tim and Nick have done quite a lot on, but it seems to me to be, that how do we get to where we want to get to is the question that we've been trying to tease out the discussion. Right.
I quite
I would
like
say.
Sorry,
Go on, mate, I'll let you talk.
Just on I quite liked Eve's point in the first session when she talked about lovable neighbourhoods. I thought, in some ways, that's where we go. We actually make places interesting. That we don't focus on words like active travel and healthy living. We just talk about interesting places, nice places to live. It's very basic, but people won't walk in the rain for activity on the whole. The people that you need to reach are not doing it for worthy reasons. They'll go to the shops in the rain if that's the most convenient way of, if that's the most convenient mode of getting there. So in some ways, I think this is, we cannot, I worry when we think about active travel on its own. It's part of a mix, and public transport is huge in that, and the B network is huge in that. Every bus journey starts with a walk. Very few of us have a bus stop outside our door or a tram station outside our door. You have to walk there or whatever, and it's making those journeys that are really important. But we design our towns around that, and at the moment we don't design public transport into our towns at all, hardly. They're added or they're inherited, and it's a really strange system with public transport and the link we're planning. It doesn't really work in Manchester, I would say. So I think that's one of the things. I'd be less thinking about, in some ways, I almost think parks come in at later stage in this. If we've got parks, great, but more often than not, we're developing in a place where in a single plot. And it's really about how we can make that a walkable start to a place, I think. So has it got near shops? Can you get across the road easily? The amount of stress that people have in waiting for lights to turn to green, to the green man. I mean, they've done research on the psychology of crossings, and your stress levels go up hugely as you wait and wait. Once it's gone past a certain time and you're expecting that light, that green man to come on and he doesn't, your stress levels go through the roof. That is not an enjoyable walk. And it's things like that where we can make a little bit of a difference, I think.
Good point. Graham, you had a point to make.
I don't know, I've kind of forgotten now. I mean, I think in terms of like new large scale development, it's quite easy because, you know, you can look at the demonstrators or, you know, good examples that we've got in this country and also abroad. But I mean, like, I know there's been work done previously on some of the urban extensions around Cambridge and how they've put like bus rapid transit through the sites to encourage people to use that rather than driving to Cambridge, etc. They'd be good examples to look at. So, you know, we could use them as a basis maybe for some of the GMSF sites. And you come back then to the how do you retrofit in the existing areas and stuff. That's something that needs to be looked at as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Because it may mean like the introduction of like low traffic neighborhoods or, you know, increasing the frequency of buses and stuff, but it's like planning is not the only thing basically. You know, it's, you know, the whole 20-minute neighborhood thing is going to require buy-in from like a whole council approach, and, you know, TFGM in terms of like the bus network and stuff when that becomes franchised, etc. So it really is like, you know, you say a whole systems approach.
Thank you for that. We had a question in the point made in the chat about accessibility. Deanne, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, good.
Yeah, so I'm a mum. I work with a lot of parents and young people who've got additional needs and disabilities and SEND and learning difficulty. And actually, my thing is when we're thinking about this, if we get this right, we make that community so much more accessible for them. You know, and it isn't a car basis. You know, we have a mobility car because Amber needs that at times, and we use the car at times because otherwise we ain't getting where we need to go. And she, you know, long trips, a lot of obstacles. But actually, when we're at home, being able to just walk to the gym, pushing her chair or her wheeling is quite nice, and means we don't take the car on a short trip 5 minutes down the road. And I suppose when we're thinking in terms of planning and housing, actually, if we think and we're building an accessible community, it's much easier and gives somebody with quite a severe level of learning disability. But if the shop's a 10 minutes walk away and it's a nice easy route and it's press a green, you know, and the road's nice and safe, actually you can create a space where people can be much more independent because you've thought about it. So there's benefits for whole different groups, really.
Yes, I mean, from my perspective, I think that's, I mean, one of the dimensions there is it alludes to some of the things that we talked about elsewhere, which is ensuring that when we're doing things with people rather than to people, so that the notion that when we're designing, when we're thinking about accessibility issues, we really do need to ensure that we're not just doing it for people, we're doing it to people, that there actually is co-design and proper engagement with those processes. Sean, you've got your hand up. I'm sorry about that.
Right, Alan. I was just going to say, actually, I do agree with the previous speakers about getting, you know, the culture right, and obviously need the whole council, different areas, and Transport for Greater Manchester, and the police, and all those sort of things. And I think it's about, isn't it, the enforcement possible things. So, you know, we can build, or we can talk about all the design guidelines and this and that, and, you know, we can have the greatest utopia of these things, and then we'll build them, and they'll be covered in cars within like 6 months, and everyone will have 3 cars parked outside, and they'll be on the pavements, and you still won't be able to get across the road because the, you know, the pedestrian crossing is still taking 30 seconds or more, you know, to come to green. And, you know, you can get in touch with the council and say, listen, there's people parking on the pavement. They'll say, it's not our job, it's the police's job. And then you get in touch with the police, and the police say, it's not our job, we have to see them do it. And so there's a whole sort of, you know, barriers against people. And I work in actual sustainable transport and have done for 20 years, and I find it soul destroying. So imagine getting someone who like just thinks, actually, I just want to walk to the park, or I just want to walk to school or walk to work. And they come across it, and within, you know, a couple of weeks, they've gone, sack this, it's not worth it. And so I think we really do need to start looking at a toolkit approach, but it has to be consistent across the whole GM authorities, because you can't just have something going great guns in Wigan, and yet in Oldham, in my authority, you know, I get passed around to like lots of different, you know, different sort of consultants who are doing the sort of the outsourcing for this and that, and they said they'll get back to you, and then, you know, so I think that's where I'm coming from. But we need to start looking from the ground up, and obviously the Ramblers will know a lot of the issues of this, and we know the problems, you know, like we have living streets on the call, and they have sort of problems with like people parking on the pavements. But even just the simple things there, we like just getting across the road on a pedestrian crossing. I can't understand why they're not on a quicker turnaround for green. It doesn't seem to make sense. And yet, I even, you know, when Transport for Greater Manchester are in charge of the crossings or someone like that, then that's something surely within our power, within our gift to do something. That's my rant, over and out.
Thank you very much for that, Sean. Just picking up part of that point, I can't remember who it was, Louise talked about whole system solutions. And that sounds grand, and it sounds kind of, but it seems to me, if we are to succeed in what we're trying to do here, we do need to make sure that these questions about how do we promote, enable physical activity, these shouldn't be pigeonholed into that's something that's to do with GM moving or to do with Sport England, but that these are questions that are central to planning policy, transport policy, policing policy, more general provision of, you know, that it is all the organisations and institutions that can have an influence, should have an influence, and that we should have mechanisms whereby the various communities can have an impact on that, and to help to develop those approaches. I want to save a few minutes at the end just to try and draw together some of the strands so that we can be feeding back to the main session. But are there any other points that we haven't covered so far that any of the colleagues on the call want to raise?
Dan's got a hand up.
I'll
make a point after.
Yeah, it was just sorry, it's just to say, like, we've been really lucky here, but I know it's not the same. Our local PCSO has made a huge difference because of no Amber, and so where she's had issues getting to the gym in a chair with her friends, they've told her, and they've gone out because there was 2 vans literally constantly blocking the walkway that was safe for her. And they were having to take her in the middle of quite a busy main road. But I know in other areas that isn't quite always the same. So, but actually, if it is done well on a community level, they can do something about it. And they were given warnings and all sorts. And now it's good, and we can get there without having to put them in the middle of the road. But I know, talking to other people who've had and done the same, they've not had quite the same response.
That's yeah, I think that's right. Thank you very much for that. Graham, you wanted to...
The only thing I was going to say, it comes down to having the skills, I think, in-house in local authorities as well. You know, we've been cut back to the bone where you've literally just got development management officers having to make decisions about whether or not a scheme is considered well designed, when they've probably had one module in a 3-year degree course about urban design. And you're looking at a layout, you know, 30 dwellings per hectare, and it's got integral garages in every single house, you know, frontage car parking, or drop curves everywhere. That 2 spaces per dwelling isn't enough for some houses, and there's no visitor car parking and corporate layouts and stuff. And I think there needs to be a massive sort of like upskilling program, I think, as well, to actually know what good layouts look like. You know, I mean, you can deliver better layouts at 30 grants per hectare than what we get basically in Greater Manchester. It just requires some time and some thought, which unfortunately, because of the cutbacks that we've had, I don't think any council, well, the majority of councils in Greater Manchester have access to.
I mean, I think to be fair to Chris Boardman and his team, they've tried hard with a fairly extensive training program and training manuals and so on. But I think
I mean, Chris, in terms of Streets for All, that's for like the highway engineers and stuff. I'm talking about, like, you know, when you get an application in front of you, and you know the planners having to deal with all the consultations and stuff coming in and stuff as well, and they're making the decisions on the layout as well. And I think that's the problem we've got in Greater Manchester, or certainly my experience.
Good point. Thanks for that, Graham. I think that's certainly a point. Louise, do you want to just to say a few words about where you think what you think the final points might be, and then get Tim and Nick just to respond to that, and any other colleague that.
Yeah. So the key things I think I've heard are something about having a toolkit between. We'll hear this afternoon what the streets rule sort of processes from TFGM, but something about we're missing that toolkit part between the vision and the sort of streets rule thing. So there's something around that as a key point. I think the some of the points around us aligning some division, I haven't quite worked out what the mechanism is, but it links to Graham's last point there about us thinking through a different process for reaching plan or authorising developments, to have these conversations in a different context, and that includes the quality that's more than just pure how far is something or what's the density here, but actually what is that environment going to be like, and then quite clearly we hear the car thing still being front and center, but didn't we hear, was it Eve earlier talking about being brave leadership, so it needs the leadership, but it also needs that trickle down support to everybody. Yeah, thanks Tim. Your connection to 20-minute neighbourhoods there will be useful, because some of that that is about quality of life in a place, and it's fine where the original slide was about New Islington and new development, you know, master planning, master development, as I think someone said, but actually it's harder. And looking at Mike and his planning committee on Trafford, you know, there are townships, little districts all over, Clare and Oldham, and several people in Oldham, little districts somewhere that want to improve their space. You know, how do we do that? It's not harder unless you bring the community with you. So minimum standards, some mechanisms, some workforce upskilling, and then there's something about the density, but in relation to public transport, sort of selling it in a holistic view. There are 3 or 4 things I got. Anything else?
Louise, Tim, Nick, final thoughts?
Yeah, I can quickly jump in just to say that, yeah, getting everyone around the same table is really important. So thinking, yeah, again, about that whole systems approach, breaking down those silos, getting all the departments together, people in the community, everyone needs to be part of this. And it's a long-term project. It's not something quick. It's not something easy. It is the long run. So yeah.
Nick.
Yeah, I was just going to say quickly on my point of view, just picking up on Graham's bit around the skills and that bit, I think that's really vital, and the leadership. And it's something that's coming up time and time again as we look for our kind of strategy work at the moment. And particularly, you know, we are in the kind of, I suppose, the leisure sector, but what we're saying is actually we need to influence those skills leadership in those other sectors and bring them together. And I suppose that is ultimately comes together in a place, and how do you bring that together in a place? So that is a big challenge for us. So.
Thank you very much for that. So I'm going to draw matters to a close now, because that's the allocated time we have. And, on my agenda, it says lunch break now, and I'm sure that be welcomed by everyone. But thank you particularly to Tim and Nick for their presentations. Thanks to Louise and Kaz for behind the scenes. Thanks to all the colleagues who have contributed to the discussion. I think it's been really useful and give us a lot of thought, a lot of food for thought that I think we want to feed back into a range of fora to take some of these forward. Thank you very much. All those that can, I'll see you later in the session this afternoon. And if you go somewhere else or you've got something better to do, have a good afternoon and thank you very much indeed. Okay, thank you.